Your child probably said it like a joke, maybe while scrolling, maybe after an hour on their phone. Something like, "I literally have brain rot," and they laughed at themselves or at whatever they were watching, and you laughed too, or let it go, or filed it somewhere under "teenagers say strange things." But something in it stayed, because there was a moment, maybe right after they said it, where something in you went quiet. Not because of the words exactly, because of the look on their face when they said them. This video is about what that phrase is actually describing. Not the meme, not the Gen Z shorthand. The thing underneath it, the real mechanism, in plain language. Because understanding it is not the same as being alarmed by it. And right now, most parents are somewhere between the two. So let's start with where the term itself came from and why it caught on the way it did. Brain rot didn't start in a research paper. It started the way most accurate things start, as something people noticed in themselves before anyone named it officially. Teenagers began using it somewhere around 2021, 2022. First as a joke, then as a description, then as something they said with a kind of tired recognition that didn't feel entirely like a joke anymore. The Oxford Word of the Year for 2024 was brain rot, not a slang term that made it into a dictionary footnote. The Word of the Year, which tells you something about how widely the experience had been named and recognized, not just by teenagers, but by the adults who are watching them. Here is the thing that gets missed in most of the coverage about why that term landed so hard. The teenagers using it are more accurate than they realize. Not in a catastrophizing way, not in a "your brain is literally rotting" way, but in the specific sense that the word rot, the sense of something useful becoming less useful over time through a particular kind of exposure, is closer to the real neuroscience than most of the parenting articles that have tried to explain this. When your child says, "I have brain rot," they are making a self-deprecating joke. They are also, without knowing it, describing something that the developmental research has been documenting for a decade. That's not a reason to panic. It's a reason to understand exactly what they're pointing at, because the moment you understand the mechanism, the joke stops being a joke. Not in a frightening way, in a useful way. Now let's talk about what the actual science tells us is happening. You already know the broad version of this. Screens are stimulating. Platforms are designed to be addictive. Dopamine is involved. Short-form content moves fast. You've read the articles. You know this part. What most of those articles don't explain is the specific mechanism, the how. The thing that makes what your child called brain rot more than a figure of speech. Here's what is actually happening. In plain terms, the brain's reward system runs on dopamine, a chemical that signals, "This is worth your attention. Do this again." Every platform your child uses has been built deliberately by teams of engineers to trigger that signal as frequently as possible with as little effort required from the viewer as possible. Short videos, instant reaction, immediate next clip, no waiting, no build-up, no slow burn towards something satisfying. The reward arrives before the effort does. Now here is the part that explains what you've been watching at home. The brain is adaptive, that's its greatest strength. It reorganizes around whatever it is asked to do most often. When a brain, especially a developing brain, one that is still literally constructing its attention architecture, spends hours each day in an environment where stimulation is constant, effortless, and instant, it begins to calibrate to that environment. It starts to expect that level of input, and things that don't deliver it. Homework, a conversation, a book, a meal, a walk, a quiet afternoon, start to register not as neutral, but as insufficient. Not boring in the way that all slow things are sometimes boring. Boring in the way that an engine calibrated for high octane sputters on regular fuel. That's the mechanism. That is what brain rot is actually describing. Not a permanent condition. Not a moral failing. A calibration shift. Measurable, real, and documented in the research on adolescent reward systems and attention development that happens gradually and visibly through accumulated hours. Research on developing brains and digital media consistently shows that the capacity for what's called slow build reward, the ability to stay with something that takes time to pay off, is among the first things to show strain under chronic high stimulation exposure. That's what you're watching when your child can't finish a sentence without checking their phone. When they pick up a book and put it down in 4 minutes. When a conversation that requires them to sit with something uncertain makes them visibly uncomfortable. That is not your child being difficult. That is a brain that has been trained by hours and hours of a very specific kind of input to expect something that real life rarely delivers that fast. Which brings us to what this actually means for your child. Specifically, this is the part that changes what you're actually seeing. Because most parents, when they watch their child lose interest in something that used to hold them, a hobby, a sport, a friendship that required effort, land on one of two explanations. Either something is wrong with the child, or something is wrong with the parenting. Both of those explanations carry weight that they were never supposed to carry alone, because neither of them is the most accurate one. The most accurate explanation is this. Your child's brain has been responding exactly as it was designed to an environment that was itself designed to produce exactly this response. The boredom that feels unbearable, that's not laziness. That's a reward system calibrated to a frequency that ordinary life can't match. The motivation that has dropped for slower activities, music practice, reading, building something, going outside, that's not apathy. That's a brain that has learned to measure effort against payoff using a scale that short-form content spent years tilting. The conversations that are harder to sustain, where your child seems present for 30 seconds and then somewhere else, that's not indifference to you. That is attention that has been shaped, hour by hour, by an environment that never asked it to hold still. This is the reframe that matters most. When your child said, "I have brain rot," even as a joke, even laughing, they were doing something that most adults never managed to do about their own patterns. They noticed. They named it. They said, out loud, in whatever shorthand they had available, "Something about the way I'm using this doesn't feel right." That's not nothing. That is, in fact, the first requirement of anything changing. And you are the parent who heard it, who didn't completely let it go, who is here, right now, trying to understand what your child was actually telling you. That matters more than the mechanism. But the mechanism is what makes it possible to respond. If what this video opened is the question of how to talk about this with your child, not the research version, but the actual conversation, the words that don't land like an accusation, there's a guide in the description built for exactly that. It's called The Brain Explanation. It includes specific scripts for children ages 6 through 16, language that opens the conversation without triggering the shutdown. The link is in the description and the pinned comment, there when you're ready for that next layer. So what does understanding all of this actually change? Here is where most parenting content about screens would give you a list of steps. Limit to 90 minutes. No phones at dinner. Introduce a hobby. Create a media plan. You already know those steps exist. And if you've tried them, you know why knowing the steps is not the same as the steps working. What understanding the mechanism actually changes is not the strategy, it's the posture. When you understand that your child's brain has been calibrated to a specific frequency of stimulation, the behavior stops looking like a choice and starts looking like a condition, not in a clinical sense, not a diagnosis, but in the practical sense that it requires a different kind of response than discipline. You don't discipline a plant for leaning toward the light. You change the conditions. That doesn't mean anything goes. It doesn't mean screens are fine, and the concern isn't real. The concern is real. The research is clear. The calibration is happening, and it does have consequences for attention, motivation, and the capacity for connection that develops slowly, through precisely the kind of presence that high-stimulation environments crowd out. But it means that the conversation you have with your child, the one about what they're watching, how long, what it's doing, can come from a different place than the one most parents start from. Not "you need to stop," which lands as an attack on a choice. But I want to understand what this is doing, and I think you do too, which is, in fact, what your child was saying when they called it brain rot. Now, the objection that's probably sitting somewhere in the back of this: my child uses this term as a joke. They're not describing a real problem. They're being dramatic. They're fine. That instinct is worth honoring. Teenagers do exaggerate. They borrow cultural vocabulary without always meaning it precisely. The indicator that distinguishes casual use from something worth attention is not the word itself. It's what you observe when the phone isn't there. Can your child sit with boredom for 20 minutes without visible distress? Can they sustain interest in something slow build for longer than a few minutes before drifting? When the device is away, do they find their way back to themselves? Or do they seem to be waiting, restless for the screen to return? Those observations don't require a diagnosis. They require a parent who is paying attention, which is, in the end, what you came here to do. If you want the specific language for taking this conversation directly to your child, words that explain the mechanism without triggering a fight, the guide in the description is built for that exact moment. Link in the description. Pinned comment has it too. When your child said something like, "I have brain rot," did it land as a joke, or did something in you go still? What was it that didn't quite let you let it go? What you came in with was a phrase, a term your child used, or one you saw in a headline that sat in you just long enough to bring you here. What you're leaving with is the mechanism behind it. Not an alarm, a map, the developing brain responding to its environment, the reward system calibrating to the frequency it's fed, the attention architecture reorganizing around whatever it's asked to do most. That's not a verdict on your child. It's not a verdict on you. It is, in fact, the most useful thing you can know right now, because a mechanism you understand is a mechanism you can begin to work with. Your child called their own experience brain rot, even laughing. Even as a throwaway line, they noticed something, they named it with the vocabulary they had, and you heard it. You didn't fully let it go. You came here to understand what they were actually telling you, which means that somewhere in this house, there is already the beginning of a conversation that hasn't happened yet. That conversation doesn't require you to have all the answers. It requires you to know enough to start. You know enough now. The child who made that joke, the one who reached, without knowing it, for the most accurate word they had to describe what they were noticing in themselves, that child is still there, not behind the screen, not lost to it, noticing. Waiting, maybe, for a parent who understands what they were actually saying. That's you. Keep going.